The views and opinions of the Jonathan Kinloch Show are not those of WADL Detroit.
Hello, I'm Jonathan Kinloch, and welcome to the debut of the Jonathan Kinloch Show here at WADL. We'll be joining you each Sunday at 11 a.m. where we'll be having a conversation on the latest information and news surrounding politics, business, entertainment, and just having a host of conversations with some great voices, both locally as well as nationally. Joining me here in the studio for my debut show is some very interesting individuals who have a wealth of knowledge and information, and we're going to hopefully get some of that information out of these folks this morning. We have Ernest Johnson of Community Coalition, as well as Paul Welday from Renaissance Strategy, and Denno, who is a pollster who actually did a very interesting poll. And it's amazing that folks are now talking about whether or not Detroit is ready for a white mayor. With all of the stuff that's going on in the city of Detroit, the consent agreement, deficits, no deficits, all sorts of stuff going on. Well, look, we got a lot. We're going to talk about the 13th, 14th Congressional District and much more on the other side of this break. And I'm very excited about this, and thank you for joining me. Welcome back to the Jonathan Kinloch Show. The presidential election is becoming very interesting here in Michigan as we see that President Obama previously had this wide lead here in the state. But right now, based on the latest polls, you have Mitt Romney right on his heels. I'm concerned about a number of different things that are taking place in Washington right now, and particularly what is on everybody's mind is the issue surrounding the decision that came out of the Supreme Court. Denno, you're the pollster. These polls have Mitt Romney right on the heels of the president. Will this decision by the Supreme Court have an impact on President Obama's ability to actually win Michigan in the fall?
I think it will have an impact. I think every poll we've seen, when you ask people, what do you think of Obamacare, people are opposed to it. But when you actually explain what Obamacare does to it, what actually Obamacare is and how it affects them, they are supportive of it. I think the most interesting thing is we are now seeing that both campaigns are kind of backsliding away from Obamacare. Neither Romney nor Obama seem to be embracing it or attacking it, and that seems to be really interesting. And I think at the end of the day, the biggest issue is still going to be the economy. If the economy can stabilize, can get a little stronger, it's going to be a huge boon for Obama. If we still have problems in Europe and China, I think that's definitely going to hurt President Obama.
Well, we're seeing some signs that the economy is trying to come back to life in certain sectors. But Mitt Romney, let's just touch on this whole issue as it relates to the President's Health Care Act. Mitt Romney is backing away from it because much of this Health Care Act basically is identical to the health care law that Mitt Romney led through the legislature when he was governor in Massachusetts. So it would be kind of hard for him to carry that message that this act or the Health Care Act is a bad law and should be repealed when you have an identical law that he championed, and there's a number of clips that basically reflect his comments at that time.
And that's part of Romney's problem with his base, and you're starting to see, at least in the most recent survey we did, that Romney is starting to pick up his base, and his base is starting to come back home to him. But that's a big reason, I think, why Republicans and a lot of the Tea Party members don't like Romney, because they see Obamacare basically as Romney care.
Well, if I could, John, let me just dispel that. Republicans, the base of the party, Tea Party, conservative activists, what have you, they've embraced Mitt Romney entirely. And I think it's a little bit of wishful thinking to think that Mitt Romney's not going to talk about Obamacare. He's made it very clear that on the first day, repealing Obamacare is at the top of his agenda. I think this notion that, well, it's a lot like what happened in Massachusetts, it's very, very different from what happened in Massachusetts. And so the Romney campaign is going to focus on health care. At the end of the day, I think Dennis is right. Jobs and the economy are what really are of main concern to folks. But where the health care issue is particularly important is what it does to motivate that base. Those Tea Party members or others who might have been a little lackluster to begin with are now excited about what the Romney campaign represents and are ready to work for his victory.
Well, Paul, the individual mandate was the main focal point prior to the Supreme Court issuing its ruling from the Republican right. The Republican leadership in the House, they were saying that the U.S. Supreme Court was going to throw out this entire bill because it was unconstitutional, because of the individual mandate, that it was further expanding the government's role in individuals' decision-making rights. So the point is that the individual mandate is something that is definitely a key component of the law that was initiated and led by Mitt Romney in Massachusetts.
Well, there's no question about that there are similarities. But the key difference, and the one that a lot of conservatives and constitutionalists fall back on, is the 10th Amendment. That the difference is that in Massachusetts, it was a state that made a decision as to what was best for Massachusetts. But to give that same authority to the federal government is very different from what our founders suggested.
Look, this is the problem that I have with folks in Washington. Make up your mind. Does the Supreme Court have the ability and the power to decide what's constitutional or not? They have decided that this law, by a majority vote of the justices, is constitutional. So I don't care what lawyers and other political pundits are saying out there in America, because they basically got a sour one with that decision, at least from the conservative perspective. The Supreme Court issued a ruling. They said it's constitutional, at least those parts that remain in effect. So you can't have your cake and eat it too. So do the Supreme Court have the ability to make a decision on what's constitutional or not?
Well, I know others have thoughts on this, but I would just say that what the Supreme Court said was that the Congress has the power to tax, and that this was a tax, which is exactly the opposite of what President Obama, Nancy Pelosi, Harry Reid, and the Democrats were saying all from the beginning. So it's a very convoluted decision, and one that left a lot of us shaking our head about where John Roberts, Chief Justice John Roberts, came down. So, but that's behind us now. Now there's the political impact, and it's going to be determined in November as to where the health care and the future of the country politically goes.
I think it makes Willie Romney looks like a flip-flopper to say that it's a mandate in Massachusetts, but it's a tax for the country, when it's both of them is the same.
Bring about the same result. Bring about the same results. And that's what we have to keep our eye on, and particularly as it relates to this issue, that the United States Congress said that we need to have as many citizens in this country receive health care. That is not the position of many of the Republicans and Republicans in Congress. And as you said, it will be about the economy. But then we also understand that there may be some issues that might have issues that might affect Mitt Romney, even on that question as well.
If we could put that also into perspective, excuse me, remember when this was passed, it was passed entirely by Democrats. Right. The only thing bipartisan about this bill was the opposition to it. And what happened as soon as the election? Boy, it flipped Republican.
Right. Well, we'll continue to keep our eye on the effects of the Supreme Court decision, and particularly here in Michigan, Battleground State. We'll be right back after this break. Welcome back to the Jonathan Kinloch Show. There are some other races around these parts that we need to pay close attention to. The 13th and 14th Congressional District races are two races that are caught the attention of the national Democratic Party, and particularly because you have the potential for two African Americans out of Michigan, actually the only two African Americans out of the Michigan delegation, to possibly in a race where they could lose their seats. The 14th Congressional District has been in the news of recent because you have race being thrown into the campaign. And not just a typical conversation about race, but actually you have individuals who have chosen to dig up an issue that many folks would have believed would have not been inserted into the race, and that is the whole conversation about whether or not Hanson Clark's deceased mother is an African American. And my question for you all is this: what relevance does that have to the issues that the citizens in the 14th Congressional District are faced with? I mean, his deceased mother, and as well as they raised some issues as it relates, or had conversations about Hanson Clark's deceased father. Is that going to be beneficial to anyone?
You know, I hear it all the time. I hear that as a big concern with a lot of Detroiters, that they want one of their own. They want an African American representing them in Congress, and I think it's really interesting that you could have in the city of Detroit the 2 Congress people not be African American, and potentially the mayor next year not be African American.
Well, the issue is that you have Hanson Clark, who has been in the African American community from the very beginning, from even before he was born and raised in the city of Detroit, and yet and still you have folks who are trying to leverage the issue of his mother, whether she's white, black, and I understand his explanation was to the fact that she was African American. And at the end of the day, that's where I'm gonna go with. That was his mother. I'm gonna go there. But I do understand there's some issues surrounding the death certificate.
Well, I know that maybe one of the 2 of the candidates, or some people that work for the candidates, has brought that issue up. That on Hanson Clark's mother's death certificate, it said that she was white. He said she was a light-skinned lady, but she was black. But she did try to pass for white to try to get him ahead and try to move the family ahead because people were trying to pass. And
we cannot ignore that fact that is a part of the African American history in this country. That you did have some light-skinned blacks who tried to and did pass as whites.
Well, let me just tell you, this debate represents, in my view, everything that's wrong with politics in the city of Detroit. When are we going to move beyond the color of someone's skin and focus on the content of their character and their ability to get things done? We talk about the issues in the race. This is not an issue in the race. This is preposterous. The issues in this race are how we're going to put people back to work, that we've got African-American young people who are unemployed, almost 50, 60%. Who cares what color his mother's skin was?
Right.
Let's get down to business and ask ourselves who of these 4 candidates can best represent
this isn't just race isn't just an issue in Detroit, though. I don't think it's fair for you to say that.
No, because the issue the issue came out of from a resident, I believe, out of Oakland County. And keep in mind, you have Gary Peters, who's in this race, who's throwing money all over the place in order to get support. And there's some who are questioning where this money or this attack is coming from.
Well, that's a legitimate question. Where's the guy's money coming from? But whether or not Hanson Clark is African American or
I agree with you there.
Mars doesn't
I agree
matter.
with you there.
The question is, who's the best candidate representing?
But you've been in a race.
Those issues?
You've been in a race with Gary Peters. You're quite familiar with Gary Peters, and so now all of a sudden you've been in a race with him.
Sure.
Those race and those contests took place in Oakland County.
Well, most of the challenges here are coming from Mary Waters. I mean, she's been the focal point in terms of trying to make these allegations that somehow Hanson Clark isn't black enough for the district. Give me a break. That's ridiculous.
That is ridiculous.
It's so disappointing. So disappointing. Like you said, with all of the issues that the citizens in the state are faced with.
She don't have nothing to run on.
But I do think it's unfair to question where Gary Peters' money is coming from. I mean, Gary Peters is always
No, we're talking about the gentleman who actually is. There's some folks saying that robocalls are being made, and there is an outright campaign to try to put this information out there to have a negative impact on Hanson Clark. I mean, that's wrong. Right.
Jonathan, you're right. It's to get away from the real issues, the real debate in this district, and let's do robocalls and say, well, Hanson Clark's mother really isn't black, you know, and suddenly that becomes the whole conversation. That's absurd. I mean, the
It's
leaders
absurd.
of the community need to stand up, and I don't care. I mean, the district's got to decide whether it's going to be Clark or Peters or Waters or Lawrence.
You know,
but to make this the issue.
You know, Paul, I didn't have a problem with the fact of how they drew these districts, because we in Michigan have been talking about having to have regional cooperation, but there has been no real move to have a real conversation about the issues that are affecting all of the communities. Now, regional cooperation is being forced on the residents. You now have folks in the city of Detroit having to coalesce or build relationships with folks north of 8 Mile in order to get their congressmen to pay attention to their issues. The whole issue is not whether or not where Gary Peters has his money, because I believe he has $2 million, and that was prior to the election getting started. The question is, where is the gentleman who actually put this information out, that's allegedly put this information out, whereas he's getting the money to actually do the robocalls and mount this campaign against Hanson Clark, or put this information out there, which has nothing to do with improving the quality of life of the folks.
Whoever's responsible should feel the backlash. I mean, the voters, the Democratic voters, should say, this is not worthy of us. We deserve more. We want more from these candidates. And if they do that, then hopefully whoever's tried to make this the central issue will pay a heavy price. I think Mr. Clark, Mr. Peters are all certainly qualified, but let's talk about what's really important, and let's get people making their decisions based on those issues, not these red herrings.
Well, it's interesting that, Dennis, you mentioned earlier about this whole racial piece, racial component piece, and the mayors as relates to potentially having a white mayor candidate in next year's election. With the consent agreement and a host of other issues that are of concerns to the citizens of the city of Detroit, we're going to talk about that as far the poll that you did a few weeks ago. We're going to talk about that on the other side of this break. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the Jonathan Kinloch Show. Before we go into all of the issues surrounding that consent agreement and the mayoral election for next year, Paul, the Republican governor, basically bucked the leadership, his own party, the leadership in his own party in the legislature, and vetoed these voter suppression laws. A lot of folks are calling them a part of the National Republicans Party agenda to affect or have a negative impact on the minority voting vote in the fall.
I believe that's all a bunch of nonsense. There's nothing voter suppression about indicating that you're a citizen before you vote. But be that as it may, let's just look at it this way. This governor is proving the point that you don't have to govern from the right or from the left, that you govern from the center. Because every politician talks about that they don't want to do it this way or that way. They want to represent the people. Governor Rick Snyder is doing that. There are a lot of people who are angry on both sides of the aisle.
But what I'm asking you, do you believe that the Republican legislature will repackage these and try to continue to push these type of laws that I feel are are overburdening the voters? I mean, you should want more participation, and at the end of the day, you shouldn't be trying to create barriers between the individual citizens in this state and the ballot box. And too often, we're seeing that come from these Republicans.
I know these guys have opinions on that too, but I think that all of that is not true. I don't think there's anything that prevents that. What I want to see is the people who are eligible to vote actually voting. And I think, again, these are not the issues. Jobs and the economy are what we should be talking about.
But this is a big issue. And you know what? This is another example of Republicans making it harder for minorities and seniors to vote, and Republicans don't want everyone to vote. And you know what? They talk about voter fraud. There is no history of voter fraud in Michigan.
Well, that's not true.
It is true.
I've been involved in it myself.
You've been involved in voter fraud in Michigan?
Let me say this. They have tried and asked for this Secretary of State to bring examples, that demonstrate that there is a glaring issue as it relates to voter fraud. But bottom line is this: the governor vetoed it. We hope that they stay dead and that the legislature don't try to repackage these bills. Now, next year, the city of Detroit voters will be going to the ballot box, and they will be going to the voting booth with a couple of things in mind: to elect mayors, elect the mayor, as well as elect council members out of districts. with the understanding that the current mayor and the majority of the city council members have brought forward a consent agreement that may or may not be in existence next year. You have a poll that you basically took a few weeks ago that it seemed to have taken on some steam as it relates to whether or not Detroit is ready for a white mayor. But they're not just saying ready for a white mayor. They're actually talking about Mike Duggan and Mike Duggan. So they've put a name associated with that potential vote.
Right. So our survey didn't name Mike Duggan. Our survey was a statewide survey, and we asked if Detroiters would seriously consider voting for a white candidate for mayor. Statewide, only 22% of voters thought Detroiters would. But within the city of Detroit, and granted it's a small sample size, within the city of Detroit, 50% of Detroiters said they would consider voting for.
What's that sample size in the city of Detroit?
I mean, it was pretty small. It was probably about 50 respondents. So again, it's a pretty small sample size.
50?
I justified it by saying it was a pretty small sample size.
Well, we haven't heard of any other polls that were taken that in regards to this. I haven't heard of any other polls that were taken. But with or without a poll, they have thrown Mike Duggan's name out there. Now we also hear Jeffrey Feiger's name being mentioned. But the issue is Mike Duggan now resides in the city of Detroit. The issue for a Jeffrey Feiger, with the new charter, you have to live in the city of Detroit a year before the filing deadline. I don't know if that's the case with Jeffrey Feiger.
I think he bought a house in somewhere in Detroit last year.
But registration, I think, Paul, if I'm correct, you have to be registered at that address, and so I don't know whether or not he's
I don't know what it is, but Detroit always had a white mayor. It's been white mayors all the time, so I don't think that's a fair question. We didn't have.
But you know what? The bottom line is this: we need to get beyond this whole issue of whether we elect a white mayor. Detroiters have elected white people for a number of different races, number of different offices, I should say. The bottom line is Detroit needs the right individual, whether they're from Mars, Venus, Jupiter, or whatever. We need to begin to have a conversation about how that individual will take the office, whoever they are, who wants to be mayor, and improve the quality of life in the city of Detroit.
My view, and albeit an outsider looking in from Oakland County, is that there's some other interesting candidates. And State Representative Lisa Howes, I think, is a very interesting candidate who may appear sort of out of nowhere.
Now quickly, because we're almost out of time, you have some other state reps who are talking about Fred Durhal, John Alumba. But the bottom line is this. Where did they demonstrate leadership in Lansing?
That's right.
So no, if we have to stop promoting individuals when they've demonstrated no sense of real leadership in their previous position.
Well, what about the current mayor? I mean, we've sort of been lost in the conversation. Is he running? Is he not running?
Well, who cares?
Well, that's the question. I mean,
who cares? I think that's what most voters are saying.
I don't think he runs.
The consent agreement, he's given up. He had to have said to himself that he's given up. He agreed to a consent agreement, and he's fighting to keep it in place.
The consent agreement is in place. When the signatures didn't get, the signatures is turned in. Now it's at the Supreme Court level. But as long as they're on hold, it don't take immediate effect. So then they laying out firemen, they selling land, everything is taking place because the signatures on hold.
But don't those things need to happen? I mean, ultimately, what we lose sight of is the problems in the city of Detroit. But the city's going bankrupt.
But it's going to be. But guess what? This consent agreement does nothing to address the legacy debt nor the structural deficit. And they came in with all of this fanfare of how they're fixing the city. But what they have chosen to do is to add more debt onto the city's debt load, and that, for me, is not an austerity plan. Denno, Ernest Johnson, and Paul Welday, I want to thank you all for joining me here on my debut show. We had a very interesting conversation, and these issues are not going to go away, especially the issues surrounding the city of Detroit, because it seems like it's a number of different court battles that are developing over there. So I want to thank you all for joining me, and we're going to continue this conversation down the road.
Great. Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.
And thank you. Here on the Jonathan Kinloch Show, I'm going to be joining you each Sunday at 11 to share with you the latest in news and information from politics, business, and any other issue that's going on around town. What I want to do is strengthen you and empower you with the information so that you can make a better decision on how you're going to either vote or purchase items, or just be aware of what's going on in our community. I'm a lifelong resident here in the city of Detroit in the metropolitan area. I have been fighting for what I believe in to improve the quality of life for all of us around here. So I want to be a part of your weekends each Sunday at 11 a.m. and share with you this information.